Excuse me.
You've got 10 minutes.
Oh, you've got 10 minutes.
Ata Maria Koto, Himehi Nui, Himehi Mahana, Kia Koto Katoa. As the chair noted, my name is Kayla Kington-Bebb, and I'm the chief executive of WWF New Zealand. WWF, the Worldwide Fund for Nature, is a not-for-profit NGO, and we're part of the international WWF network. We are, in fact, the world's leading conservation organization, and we're active in over 100 countries with more than 5 million supporters worldwide. I'd like to thank the committee this morning for the opportunity to speak to our submission on the Fast Track Approvals Bill. Simply put, WWF believes this bill is nothing more than a fast track to environmental destruction. It overrides critical environmental laws, places too much power in the hands of a select few ministers, and removes the rights of New Zealanders to have a say on processes that affect them and our shared natural environment. When Aotearoa already has the highest species extinction rate in the world, and we are in the midst of a climate crisis, taking forward this bill in its current form and without significant changes would be reckless, irresponsible, and frankly, morally reprehensible. It is further astonishing to me that the responsible ministers have had the arrogance to congratulate themselves on the speed with which this bill has been developed. By condensing 3 years of work into 3 months, the resulting bill is poorly constructed and it is deeply flawed. It is structurally complex, unnecessarily so. And it's quite obvious to us that the decision to extend the scope of the fast track regime to other environmental laws beyond the RMA was taken midway through the drafting process. It is also evident to us that scant consideration has been given to the broader implications of this scheme for our environment, our democracy, and on our international commitments. And for this reason, we consider the policy decisions that underpin the bill as shaky and as flawed as its construction. We strongly urge the government to withdraw the bill altogether. If progressed, a significant overhaul is required to ensure that it properly protects the rights of New Zealanders and the native landscapes and the wildlife that make us who we are. Firstly, I'd like to talk about the impact of this bill on New Zealand's native biodiversity. Our biodiversity is in steep decline, and in stark terms, by pushing forward with this legislation, we will be responsible for driving some of our native species to extinction. I would question whether the ministers responsible for this bill, and indeed the Minister of Conservation himself, really feel comfortable with this. The bill in its current form does not have sufficient safeguards in place to ensure the impacts of expedited development on nature and people are appropriately managed. It undermines New Zealand's conservation and wider environmental legislation in both its elevation of development above all else in the purpose statement and in the lack of environmental criteria to guide the expert panel recommendations and ministerial decision-making. At a minimum, if this bill is progressed, additional criteria to guide recommendations and ministerial decision-making must be added. This should include explicit consideration of climate mitigation, adaptation, and resilience outcomes, and the protection of our Indigenous species and ecosystems. The second point I'd like to raise is that we believe this bill is actually counterintuitive to ministers' stated objective of speeding up the consenting of significant infrastructure. We understand and in fact support the desire to streamline processes. However, we do not consider the bill will make the consenting process any faster or cheaper. If left unaddressed by this committee, the bill's ambiguities and inconsistencies will result in years of debate and litigation. It is also extremely alarming to us that currently prohibitive activities under the RMA, as well as projects that have already been declined by independent expert bodies or the courts on environmental grounds, are eligible for fast tracking. Such projects might include the Tikuha open cast coal mine on public conservation lands, which was rejected by the courts, or the Hananui marine farm, which was declined by an independent board of inquiry under the former government's fast track process. For the impacts it would have on endangered species. These projects were stopped for good reason. And in our view, there is no legitimate justification for currently prohibited activities or already declined projects to be eligible for fast tracking. And we urge this committee to recommend significant changes to the bill in this regard. Additionally, one of the matters we didn't raise in our submission was the consideration of whether this system could enable the best or highest value use of resources. This is, as the committee knows, a problem in the context of the current RMA regime, and this fast-tracking approach looks to exacerbate it. Recently, a group of offshore wind developers has warned that if the Trans-Tasman Resources proposal to mine the seabed off of the Taranaki Bight is granted fast-track consents, that it would be incompatible with offshore wind development in that area. This is deeply problematic, given this government has attempted to assuage environmental concerns about this bill by pointing out its potential to expand renewable energy projects. And without addressing this issue, the fast track approvals bill stands to obstruct the government's own climate and renewable energy targets, which is quite a perverse outcome. In a similar vein, it is plain to us that no proper consideration has been given to the potential impacts of the bill on our international commitments. New Zealand's free trade agreements with both the European Union and the United Kingdom have world-leading provisions to make clear that neither party should weaken their environmental laws to drive trade. In overriding our environmental laws to drive growth and by unwinding key environmental protections, we believe this bill breaches the terms of these free trade agreements, which would undermine many of our export industries and sabotage our trade access. We have seen with the recent Sea Shepherd case in the US that other nations do have the ability to impact our export markets should our environmental actions be seen to be found wanting. And lastly, this bill, in our opinion, is deeply undemocratic. The problems with concentrating this much power in the hands of 3 development-focused ministers have been well traversed by others, so I won't go into that today any further, but just to say that we vehemently object to that approach for a host of reasons and consider it needs to be rejected. More broadly, one of our key concerns is that this bill erodes the opportunity for public input. New Zealanders care deeply about our natural environment. Our connection with it is woven into the very fabric of our national identity. But with this regime, community voices won't be heard in the consenting process, even when the development in question could have impacts far beyond the individuals directly affected. Concerningly, it also places no duty on ministers to give effect to the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi. It undermines treaty rights by constraining consultation requirements effectively to what is specifically required in treaty settlements. Treaty rights exist outside of settlement too, as was confirmed by the Supreme Court in the 2018 Naitai ki Tamaki decision, a decision the Minister of Conservation himself should be very familiar with. Locking out iwi, hapu, and the public altogether from decision-making sets our country on a deeply concerning path. As a previous submitter noted, Schedule 2, Part A of the bill will list projects to be automatically sent to expert panels for consideration and recommendation, and Part B will list projects that joint ministers can consider in referring to expert panels. But neither list will have any projects in it until the bill returns to the House from this committee process. These lists are core to understanding the full impact of the final bill, yet they have not been made available for public scrutiny, and projects can be added by a whim by ministers. This is untransparent, and frankly, we consider it is wholly unacceptable. The list of projects need to be publicly consulted on, and we consider that this committee needs to be given the chance to interrogate them properly. As a matter of urgency, we consider that the processing of this bill should be halted until this takes place. And even without those lists being made public, we note there has been a fairly remarkable outpouring of criticism of this bill, and a wide range of concerns have been raised about the impacts it will have on both our environment and New Zealand's democracy. We implore this committee and the government to take heed of this feedback. Thank you again for your time today. Nō reira, tēnā koutou, tēnā tātou katoa.
Kayla, thank you very much. Several members have got questions. We'll start with Rachel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just a quick question around the specifics of fast track. One of the claims that the government and ministers have been making is that this is a lift and shift from the fast track that was put in place during the COVID period. And I'm just interested if you have any remarks around the differences and what you would see as being, you know, the pros and cons of the previous fast track that was used, and any changes that you would like to see that perhaps reflected more of that style of fast track as opposed to what's in the bill.
So I guess I'll just note two main departures from the previous government's fast tracking regime, which are pretty obvious, to be frank. One is the breadth of this bill. So the previous fast tracking regime was constrained to the Resource Management Act 1991, whereas this proposal includes the broader pantheon of New Zealand's environmental and conservation laws. And in my opinion, one of the biggest problems with the bill is that in its purpose statement, it elevates development above all else and doesn't strike for any type of balancing, which is a fairly dramatic departure from what the former fast tracking regime provided for. Secondly, obviously, the proposed role of ministers in taking final decisions and potentially even being able to reject advice by the expert panels is another very concerning, significant departure. And those are the two areas that we would point to as being most challenging and problematic in this context.
So you wouldn't call it a lift and shift of this?
Absolutely not. Yeah.
Kayla, we've come to the end of our allocated time, but as always, WWF submissions to this committee are welcome. We appreciate the time and effort that you've put into it and members of your team, and I'm sure the continuing conversation will continue.
Lovely. Nice to see you all.
Mr.
Thank you.
Chair.
Thanks very much.
Thank
Yeah, was it 10 minutes?
That was 10 minutes.
Long.